Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today to talk about publishing in a pandemic. I've got some slides to help guide the conversation here. There we go. All right, so let's get underway. By far, in my opinion, the biggest publishing story in 2020, as well as what's probably going to be the biggest publishing story in 2021, is just how amazingly well books are doing. COVID, in fact, led to record book sales in 2020. For print alone, sales were up more than 8%. And here I've got a graph on the screen that shows figures as tracked by NPD BookScan. This is the service in the United States that tracks book sales through point of purchase. So that means BookScan is looking at books bought through independent bookstores, chain bookstores, Amazon, Target, Costco, all sorts of places where you would buy a book, and other types of retailers that may not specialize in books but sell them. So you can see from the time that NPD started tracking, we have now reached one of the biggest peaks in book sales since they started keeping track. You have to go back about more than 10 years in order to see the sort of book sales that we experienced in 2020. And book publishing, this is remarkable because book publishing is considered a mature industry. That means it's elderly. It's been around for hundreds of years at this point. And so we don't normally see it as a growth industry, but it has been behaving like that since the pandemic started. So that is the silver lining for book publishing, for authors, and for many who are up and down that supply chain. Although there are some who are suffering, and we will talk about those people as well. Now, lest you think that 2020 was an outlier, we now have really strong evidence that 2021 is in fact going to be the same, if not better. So before I get to that, though, I do want to show, well, actually, no, this is specifically about 2021. Most categories so far in 2021 are outselling 2020. So this chart on the screen shows the first half of the year. So from January through June of 2021, looking at a comparison. And you'll see that sales, these are print book sales, sales are up by 18.5%. Again, this is unprecedented levels of growth, and it affects so far every print format and every category, with the exception of juvenile nonfiction, which you'll see from the chart is down a few percent. Now, why is it down a few percent? It's mainly because at the same time last year, there were astronomical sales for juvenile nonfiction because of homeschooling, kids at home needing entertainment. All sorts of reasons led to really dramatically increased sales in educational materials. So the fact that it's down a few percent is actually not all that concerning. It makes sense given how much, like it was in maybe the 3-digit increase in 2020. So that now is coming back down to earth. All of this has led to a really enthusiastic set of publishers who are now acquiring more. So in fact, if you look at a recent talk given by the CEO of HarperCollins, this was just last month, Brian Murray said, "We've been very aggressive over the last 6 to 9 months in trying to sign up the best books that we see in the marketplace." So he referenced the book pie becoming 15% bigger. So again, this is, I sound like a broken record, but I've been working in publishing since the late 1990s, and there is really nothing comparable to this sort of experience, except maybe the advent of the Kindle and with ebooks, where we saw a really huge growth as people adopted that format. But this is even more remarkable because it's across all formats. It's not just about ebooks, it's about print and ebook and also audio, which we're going to talk about. Young adult fiction for 2021 is a big piece of the growth that we're now seeing. And again, looking at figures from NPD BookScan, which has been tracking this category since 2013, you'll see that we now have the highest level of YA fiction sales, 26% growth year to date. And what is the fascinating piece of this reported on by NPD is that it's driven not by new releases, which is what you typically find. It's being driven by older titles, or what we call backlist. So in normal publishing years, and this is not a normal publishing year, but in normal years, what you see are that new releases from really hot authors will juice the numbers and lead to big sales on a month-to-month or quarterly basis. So like when there's a new Harry Potter book, or there's a new Hunger Games installment, these things can really drive sales during particular periods. But that's not the case in 2021. It's being driven by older titles, which is a pretty curious phenomenon. And you may have seen headlines in the New York Times about TikTok and about how people crying over books on TikTok is leading to increased sales. And so now, if you've been in a bookstore lately, you may see displays that are specifically focused on books that are trending on TikTok under the hashtag BookTok. It's definitely something to check out if you have the TikTok app on your phone. If you haven't looked at it, you should be looking at it. Now, this affects all sorts of titles, not just young adult, but it had a particularly outsized effect on young adult. And it's not celebrities who are, making these recommendations. It's not necessarily accounts with millions of followers. TikTok isn't like that. TikTok is different than your other social networks in that everyday people can have content that takes off. It doesn't matter how many followers they have. The algorithm works differently than a Facebook or a Twitter, where the size of your following can dictate whether or not your posts get seen. On BookTok, if you have really relevant content that people like, it will break out and get shared. And so that's also part of what's exciting here, is that it's the so-called average person or people who are really great at using BookTok, making these recommendations and boosting books up the charts. We Were Liars by Lockhart is one of the titles that's been doing particularly well. Now, there is actually a broader set of a broader trend over the last decade, in fact, where backlist has been performing better. So again, backlist refers to older titles, things that have been out more than a year. In 2020, backlist hardcovers actually outsold new releases. And it may happen again this year. We're only halfway through the year, but I would fully expect it to stick to trend. In 2010, we saw that 54% of all print sales were backlist. By 2020, that had jumped up to 67%. And it's been climbing little by little by little by little over the last 10 years. During 2020, it sped up, backlist sales sped up. And some of that has to do with the changing ways that we now buy books. Discovery has moved more online, and in online spaces, things really flatten out. There is what we call the long tail of sales that goes across the whole history, the whole library of Amazon, and the millions of titles are now available to us. And you don't necessarily see new titles given a priority over older titles. So speaking of bookstores, let's just pause briefly to talk about what's been happening there, because if there is a segment that is suffering more, it's the bricks and mortar bookstore. Like any physical retailer during the pandemic, there has been a struggle. So in the United States, Barnes and Noble, it's now a privately held company, so we don't know exactly how good or how bad it's doing, but the CEO, James Daunt, has come out and said roughly that sales were down by about 20%. Again, they don't have to release those figures, and so we're just taking his word for it. If we look at other bookstores, though, Indigo, which is the chain bookstore in Canada, Waterstones, which is the chain bookstore in the UK, they actually had better performance. If we're to take that 20% seriously, that's terribly bad news for Barnes and Noble, because other chains seem to have been less affected and sustained or weathered the pandemic a bit better. B&N's performance does, however, look better than the average, the national average of independent bookstores, which if you look at the US Census Bureau, it showed that they had declining sales of around 28%, but it really varied, okay? So the independent bookstore in your town may have done really well, it may have done average, or it may have really been hit hard. It depended on whether that store was already set up well to facilitate online sales, to do things like curbside pickup. There were other stores that really didn't have much of a web presence at all. They had no email newsletter list, they had no social media. And so when lockdowns came and stores closed, it was very hard for them to reach out to readers and sustain sales. So it really depended on the foundation or the assets of each store. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this, before I leave the Barnes and Noble situation, is that James Daunt has said about the performance of his store that, you know, online sales specifically, meh, they didn't necessarily, like, they maybe did a little better, but not a lot better. If you look at what independent bookstores have reported, the ones that did well saw like 1,000% increases in online sales. So for James Daunt to be kind of like, online didn't really affect us, is not a good sign for the US chain that a lot of publishers would like to see survive. So that brings us to the elephant in the room, which I've been navigating around so far, Amazon. Online sales, of course, are way up for everybody. Like, there's probably no retail sector that escaped this. And of course, the same is true for books. Generally speaking, Amazon sales are up somewhere around 30 to 40%. And I think they're still climbing. They have just, been profiting off of the pandemic life. But the silver lining here for those in the publishing community is that Amazon lost a bit of book market share. So the pandemic brought a set of circumstances that actually made people more interested, willing, motivated to purchase from local stores, from a different set of stores than before. We're more concerned about where we buy from a mission or social responsibility perspective. And so those sorts of factors have helped independent bookstores and other types of chain stores to grab away a little bit of that market share on the book side. Now, another factor with that's been very interesting to watch is Bookshop. Now, if you're not familiar with Bookshop, you definitely need to check out this site. It launched in January 2020, right before things got really serious with the pandemic. It was a very fortuitous launch, or timing for this launch. Of course, I don't think Andy Hunter knew what was coming. He's the founder of Bookshop. But this is a retail site, online retail site, that just sells books and is meant to be a direct competitor to Amazon, to provide a virtuous alternative to buying books online from Amazon. So his goal, he said, is to snatch a crumb from the giant's mouth. His only purpose in launching this was maybe to get that 1% or that 2% of sales away from Amazon, because he feels like if he can just get a small amount away, that's enough. That's enough to sustain independent bookstores and the larger book publishing ecosystem. Well, he met that goal and exceeded it a long time ago because of the pandemic. They had a white-knuckled ride as sales just, exploded because people wanted to buy from local stores, and Bookshop helps facilitate that. So every purchase from Bookshop, you can decide what store benefits from that purchase, and then a portion of all profits, regardless of what store you're buying from through Bookshop, a portion of profits goes back to support booksellers in the United States. And they've sold millions and millions and millions of dollars worth of books so far. So the demand was such too that they've launched in the UK. And I want to say they might be launching in Spain, or they've launched somewhere in Europe. So it's been a really good news story, although there are some who criticize it, saying, well, this could steal away sales from independent booksellers who are doing just fine without Bookshop. But the intention is not to be harmful. So we'll see. We'll continue to watch and see how this plays out. But it really couldn't have been better timed. Now, one of the questions on the mind of everyone in book publishing is whether or not people will continue to purchase online now that they've been trained for a year to make a lot of purchases through a website or through mobile. This is a study by McKinsey looking at the potential for sales to stick online and for digital acceleration to continue. Notice books way out there on the right-hand side of the graph, indicating they have the highest potential to remain online for sales. This is a pretty big deal. Some people in publishing say that online sales were already 50% pre-pandemic. The pandemic brought us perhaps 70% online sales. That doesn't mean ebook, just that the purchase was made online, regardless of format. So that really promises to change not just, the fortunes of bookstores, but also the sorts of marketing campaigns that get done, how publishers market books. When you don't have in-store displays that are really critical for launching a book, what do you switch to spread the word about new releases? So this is one of the challenges on the horizon for both publishers and authors. So let's switch gears a little bit to ebook sales. Now they have been up as well, although print is definitely the success story here. The print market has been preserved, it's very strong, but ebook sales are up too. It depends on where you look, just how much they're up. Traditional publishers, if you average it all out, it's somewhere around 17% up versus 2019. If you look at ebook distributors like Smashwords, Draft to Digital, which are known for distributing self-published titles, usually they're up more. Subscription services, which we'll get to later, this would include Scribd, Storytel, Kindle Unlimited, all indicators are that they're way up. And libraries also saw dramatically increased digital circulation, places like Hoopla and Overdrive. Overdrive specifically, they distribute to libraries, ebooks and audiobooks to libraries in the US. They saw sales increase by 1/3. The interesting thing here too is that international markets really took off for ebook sales and for subscription sales too. Europe has been more resistant generally to adopting ebooks than the US and and also the UK to some extent. And so you would find often tiny percentages of ebook sales in Spain, France, Italy, like less than 5% sometimes. But the pandemic has changed all that. The people who said, I will never, ever buy an ebook have suddenly decided, well, if I have no other choice, like if the choice is between no book and ebook, well, I guess I'm going to read an ebook. So the international market has also shifted to be more accepting of digital formats. We've seen subscription services blossom in Europe and other markets. So that's also promises to change how books get sold in the future. Audiobooks are still growing, although not quite at the same percentage clip as before. So they've really been growing, I think, for the last 7 or 8 years. It's what publishers tend to be most excited about. The percentage growth dropped to 12% in 2020, but it grew from a very small base. So of course, the percentage growth is going to probably decrease as the years go by because the base is bigger. You'll see the graph here showing the growth for the last 6 years. There weren't any unit figures given for 2020, so we've just got the dollar amounts, but the number of titles being produced in audio also continues to grow. The most popular audio genres, if you're curious, are mystery, thrillers, and suspense, particularly crime fiction or true crime as well. History, biography, and memoir. Think of, the Obama memoir, for example. And then science fiction and fantasy also does very well in audio. And some of the reason for that is that the books are long and really meaty. And so, especially in the US or UK, where Audible, big audiobook retailer owned by Amazon, if you're using Audible, you're on a credit system. And so you want to spend your credit in a very thoughtful way to give you the most listening hours. And so longer books tend to benefit from the credit system because people want that longer, richer experience if they can. Children's books, on the other hand, do not do well in these systems because, especially think about a picture book or a short chapter book, people don't want to spend their credit, which might cost them, $15 a month on a short book. I mentioned subscription services have been doing really well. Here is a graph from Findaway Voices. This is an audiobook distributor that releases the stats on where the audiobooks are getting sold or listened to. They had really significant growth, like everyone else, during 2020, with a bigger piece of the pie going to retail subscription. So that includes Audible, Storytel, Scribd, and other services where it's either a credit model or it can be an all-you-can-eat sort of service. You'll notice that before the pandemic hit, they had it was more evenly divided among retail a la carte, retail subscription and library, and now retail subscription has become more popular. It's probably both due to the pandemic, but just also due to more consumers liking the subscription model. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So I mentioned earlier, Brian Murray of HarperCollins said that we're acquiring more, we're trying to buy as many books as possible. And Publishers Marketplace, this is the website and newsletter, Publishers Lunch, that tracks publishing deals. Now, this isn't an exhaustive tracking of deals. It's self-reported, but Publishers Marketplace has been tracking these deals since around 2000. And so they have a lot of historic data. And they have noticed that deal making is indeed up. Overall, it's up 8% after being flat for 4 years. Adult fiction grew the most. Debut, meaning first novels, those deals are also up, and women's fiction and romance are also seeing very good growth. Another area of deals that are increasing, page to screen. So this is where books get adapted to movies, TVs, Netflix specials, and so on. And there was a really great panel of people who work on this side of the business where they're trying to find literary intellectual property to make deals around. And Mac Hawkins, who's a scout or an agent in this area, said that we're going to find audiences will want to be entertained in a not cynical way. We're tired of cynicism. Interesting, fun, smart pieces of material will do very well. The nature of these deals is also shifting quite a bit. This particular panel, which was part of the US Book Show, that's the replacement for Book Expo in the United States. At the US Book Show, they were talking about how the nature of the deals is changing because streaming services operate on a different financial model than your typical, movie or TV series in the days before streaming and subscription. So subscription models are changing a lot of the financial workings of the industry. And as more and more consumers get into streaming and subscription models, publishers and authors are going to have really hard decisions to make. And again, we're going to discuss that more as we get to the end of the presentation here. As far as what agents and publishers are looking for, especially, I want to remind you of what Mac Hawkins just said, because that's very true, not just for what we watch on the screen, but also what we read on the page. But generally, outside of that, agents and publishers are interested in underrepresented voices, neuroatypical protagonists, characters with disabilities, queer voices. Anyone who's been watching, Twitter in particular this will not come as a surprise. If you've been browsing submission guidelines, you'll see a lot of emphasis on trying to bring in BIPOC writers and others who have not had their share of opportunities in the past due to discrimination or racism. So there's a lot of effort to try and get more of those deals. There's also just on a market basis where market demand lies, there's a lot of demand for children's nonfiction of all ages, feel-good fiction and romance. You could consider it escapist, but not cynical. Crime fiction and true crime continues to do well. You'll see this across movies, TV, podcasts, and books. And a lot of people are just saying no to dystopias right now. And I don't think it's hard to understand why. If you're in a pandemic, if you're in a bad political situation, if you're fighting with your neighbors over politics, you're probably trying to move away from that in your entertainment. So YA dystopia in particular is having a tough time. It doesn't mean those things will never get published, and there's always, room for things that are in low demand if it's done in a new way, in a fresh way, or in a way that's surprising. So now I want to move on to a few myths and misconceptions about the industry, especially some of these are long-term myths and misconceptions. Some of them are really recent and have been exacerbated during the pandemic. So one of the big concerns or anxieties for authors and agents alike, and also people who work at smaller publishing houses, is whether Big Five New York publishing mergers mean a less diverse market, something that would be bad for literature and art. So for those who aren't aware, there are 5 really big houses in the US and also globally. These are houses that tend to have an international presence. So that includes Penguin Random House, Macmillan, Simon & Schuster, Hachette, and HarperCollins. Those are the big 5. And, Penguin Random House, those two, it used to be just Penguin and just Random House. They merged, I think, in 2012 or 2013. And Simon & Schuster was put up for sale and has now been acquired by Penguin Random House, although that has to be approved by regulators in the US. It's already been approved in the UK, so we shall see what happens there. So this type of merger activity where we might have the big 4 by the end of this year is, as I said, disconcerting to people. People worry about more restrictive terms, lower advances, things happening in the market that would not otherwise happen. But I think we can all take heart in the fact that the trends don't necessarily favor these big 5 houses when you look at what's actually selling. So the largest share of sales, at least in the United States, belongs to publishers outside the top 15. And this is looking at NPD BookScan. And even the CEO of Penguin Random House himself has said, they distribute lots of smaller independent publishers because this helps, them be more efficient with their supply chain. If they're dealing with lots and lots of books from other publishers, distributing them, it helps keep the costs down. So he's mentioned, we distribute countless publishers that do better selling their books than we do with our own in-house titles. So there is, in my experience too, since I got into the business, there is a lot of opportunity for small publishers to enter the market because of new tools and technologies that we have today, like print on demand, and the fact that it's very straightforward to get your books distributed online where most sales are happening. So you don't have to have that big Barnes and Noble display. You don't have to have that nationwide on the ground distribution in order to sell your book. So this, again, opens up a lot of opportunities for small independent players. And the sales trends also clearly are pointing at that's true, that more smaller actors are entering and succeeding. So the big books and big titles have fewer advantages online. It's Barnes and Noble itself actually is, even if we didn't have the online space, it stopped accepting co-op and merchandising agreements from big publishers. And the reason for that is that the new leadership, James Daunt, has said they want to give local booksellers the power to make decisions about what should be stocked in their own store rather than having a nationwide mandate come down from corporate. It makes a lot of sense, but that's not how Barnes and Noble used to operate. Corporate would say, you have to display these books, even if you know your customers aren't going to like them in Idaho. So this also changes things for how books get marketed and sold. It gives those big titles less advantage because publishers can't pay for placement on a national scale, at least not at Barnes and Noble. There's also been a greater shift to direct-to-consumer sales, and this has partly been accelerated by the pandemic. So again, think about all of the different types of retailers you might have purchased from, where you made your first purchase from them online during 2020 or 2021, and you might not have done that before. More publishers, smaller publishers and large, are selling direct-to-consumer because they now have consumers' email addresses, they reach them on social, and it's just much easier to deliver that call to action, and they don't have to rely on bookstores to reach them. So any small player that has that direct-to-consumer connection is in a position to sell. And for those who really want to get into the weeds of this, into the competition that's happening in online retail, all you have to do is look at what's happening with Shopify. So Shopify is an e-commerce tool that makes it very easy to set up an online store and to warehouse, fulfill physical goods. And so that affects everyone, not just book publishing. The other really interesting situation here is that the largest distributor and wholesaler of books in the United States, Ingram, makes it very easy for anyone to drop ship books from Ingram as if it were being shipped from them. So your local bookstore, if it gets an order from you for the latest bestseller and they happen to be out of stock, or they don't have it and they just don't have it in their store to send, they can basically have that, they can facilitate that order directly through Ingram, which they're buying from anyway, and just have Ingram ship it directly to you from their warehouses rather than bringing it into their store and then shipping it from their store, or you having to go pick it up. So Ingram is a real giant behind the scenes that people don't realize is responsible for all sorts of publishers and retailers alike being able to reach people directly without a lot of work. In fact, in June 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, when we had a number of Black Lives Matter related books hitting the bestseller lists, like the Kendi book or the D'Angelo book, some other books, they were on the bestseller list and they could stay there and bookstores could sell them because the books were being printed on demand through Ingram and getting fulfilled in that way. So Ingram is quite a winner in all of this. They managed to keep the supply chain together, and I would say that they have gotten much stronger as a result of what's happened, and they are definitely relied upon by many industry players. There is the question and the anxiety about debut authors struggling in this new environment. So if you had a new novel or nonfiction book or children's picture book come out in 2020 or even the first half of 2021, you may have found it harder to do events, or you couldn't do the sorts of marketing and promotion in store that you would have liked. Obviously, there aren't really any tours that are happening. Maybe they're just now starting up again. So without that merchandising in store and that really good physical presence, does that disadvantage the new author? And, you know, we don't know yet, is the honest truth. Some feel like it has been damaging, but there are other ways in which we have seen debut authors do just fine. So for instance, in the UK market, if you look at the top 10 debuts, in 2020, they actually had better sales than in 2019. But on the flip side, maybe one of the reasons for that is that the title output dropped by 15%. So one wonders, because publishers were more conservative in the number of titles they published, were they able to better focus on and market and promote the titles that they did have? It's an open question. I don't know, but I think it's pretty interesting to think about. The truth is, publishers have lots of ways to market and promote, but they've often relied on the same buttons and levers that they've always used, which is to send out a lot of physical advanced review copies and to do in-store merchandising. And now they have to think about it very differently, about how they're going to get a new author to break out. It is possible. They just can't rely on the same old things that worked 10 years ago. So there will have to be innovation. Now I'd like to talk about some of the things that I'm watching closely. Going to Marcus Dooley, the CEO of Penguin Random House, last month, he said he was discussing the 6 indicators in the book publishing industry that show that it's very healthy. One of them is that sales of books, particularly print, has been growing. And then one of the other indicators is that children's books have been a key area of growth ever since the introduction of Harry Potter. And he says, we just need to make them lifelong readers at an early age, then the future of books and reading will be bright. And so that is definitely something that everyone in publishing is pretty happy about the children's category, YA category. If you look at middle grade, it's doing really well. Picture books continue to do well. Board books are doing well. So if, as Marcus says, if we have readers at an early age, there's no reason to believe that they're going to stop reading as long as the activity is encouraged and publishers keep marketing wisely. The other interesting thing about the children's market relates to illustrated titles. So comics and graphic novels in particular are seeing some really significant growth. Well, graphic novels more than comics. So this is a 50-50 adult juvenile market. And the interesting thing here is that adult fiction growth in 2020 was driven by graphic novels. And so this is a format that publishers have introduced new imprints, new initiatives. Often when I see a new imprint announced, there's something about it that's either related to the children's market or to illustrated books, to graphic novels, to manga. So this is another point of light. But I think in the past, at least when I was young, there was a lot of judgment surrounding reading the sorts of things that you read, and sometimes comics weren't considered proper literature, but times are changing, and that is absolutely not true, that these stories and books aren't proper. Anything that encourages reading, I think we want to celebrate. Similarly, or at the same time, we're seeing the rise of something called online literature. So online literature is a phenomenon that started in Asia. with I think it was first called cell phone novels, where writers would write their novels literally on their cell phones and then publish their novels or stories in installments. Sometimes the last few installments would be withheld to get people to buy the book. But that seed, the cell phone novel, has led to a really significant empire of online literature. This is a real wellspring of intellectual property with a lot of acquisitions activity surrounding it. So some of the companies you may have heard of include Wattpad, Webtoon, Tapas, and China Lit. And these companies compete with each other. Actually, Wattpad and Webtoon just basically merged. They're now owned by the same South Korean company. Now, some people think, oh, well, this is that funny Asian thing, and it's not really pertinent to the US market. But I think that's not thinking long-term enough. Wattpad is a Canadian-based company. While it is now owned by a South Korean company, these are English language stories. They are text-driven. Now that we've got Webtoon joining it, we've got something very similar, only it's illustrated. And these companies are making lots of deals with TV, movie, brands, all sorts of deals in order to profit from that intellectual property. And many creators, especially outside the US and other cultures, see these platforms in a positive way as giving them a chance to earn a living off of their stories. So it's a place where these companies are looking at their creators in a way that's different than your traditional book publisher. And I'm not going to say it's worse or better, it's just different. And I think for now, the creators, as long as the companies act ethically and keep their promises, the creators are pretty happy about the arrangement. Amazon has noticed what's happening in online literature, and they just this week launched Kindle Bella. Now, Kindle Bella is essentially serialized stories. It's focused on fiction, but there is a nonfiction category where you can find some memoir and a little bit of how-to, but it's driven for the moment by fiction, although we'll see how it develops. So if you want to read Bella stories, you open up your Kindle, the Kindle app, and there's a specific section where you can go to browse Bella. The first few installments are free to read, but if you want to continue reading the entire story, you have to pay. And you pay through a virtual token currency that you buy 140 tokens for a couple bucks, and then you can spend your tokens on buying stories. This is really new, so there's no way to know exactly what's going to happen here and if it's going to succeed, but I think it's super interesting and shows that Amazon is paying attention to the rise of online literature and realizes, ebooks aren't the only way that people read. Young people like serialized stories. They like reading on mobile. Mobile stories have more interaction. There's more potential for interesting rewards and also interaction with authors. Although currently, Bella, there is no author interaction, but on those other platforms I mentioned, like Wattpad and Webtoon, there is creator and reader engagement, which is very often exciting for the fans. The other thing to watch is Amazon's share of advertising. So this, once upon a time, we thought that it was impossible for Google and Facebook to be hurt by any other competitor in the advertising space. But we have now seen Amazon make really significant inroads. As you can see, a growth from 2% to 9-10% in the last couple of years. It's only skyrocketed during the pandemic, more people advertising on Amazon to sell their products. This has affected authors rather directly because if you're self-published, if you want anyone to notice your book on Amazon, you tend to have to advertise somewhere. Some advertise on Amazon, some advertise on Facebook, some advertise in both places. So this is also happening to publishers who feel they have to engage Amazon in some way on an advertising level. It's like the new form of merchandising or co-op that we used to have with Barnes and Noble. So it's just becoming more of a pay-to-play situation if you want your book to surface. So with audio, there is what I call the audio wars happening, and maybe you've seen this in the news, a different model everywhere you look. So you've got Audible, which is focused on a la carte sales, but also has a subscription model. We've got Storytel, where you can listen to as much as you want for one price, which is not yet available in Anglophone markets. It's very popular across Europe and some other select countries, but it's not yet prevalent for English language titles. So those two models are kind of battling it out. The Audible subscription isn't really a subscription in the same way Storytel is. You're still limited in what you can consume. And then we've got another player entering closer and closer into the book space, which is Spotify. And they work on a freemium model where everything is free to stream, but they're going to annoy you with ads and some other things or with reduced functionality. Spotify has been, getting its feet wet in the audiobook arena by doing some public domain classics narrated by celebrities. There are also companies that will chop up your audiobook into basically like music tracks, like little mini chapters, and then upload it to Spotify to see, if any traction can be gained by chopping up the book in that way. I think that we're going to see a lot of interesting things happen in this space over the next 5 years that could really change how we think about books finding their audiences. Storytel and Spotify, these are both companies headquartered in Sweden, and they actually announced a partnership recently where you could access your Storytel subscribers could access their audiobooks or audio content through Spotify. So there's already some very fascinating integration going on there, and it'll, keep an eye on any announcements made by those two companies. The big question, I think, on everyone's mind is how much the Anglophone market, like Audible subscription services, are going to follow the European model or the Storytel model. Something that's happened, particularly in the Nordic countries, is that audiobooks now represent the majority of fiction sales. That's true in Sweden, and I think it's true in all the Nordic countries at this point, and the growth is really significant elsewhere in Europe. These tend to be backlist driven services. So 70% of consumption in Storytel is backlist. And then a la carte sales, though, like through Audible, is 80% front list. So a lot of the arguments you will find here when people talk about all you can eat subscription sales is that they tend to favor backlist sales and they don't cannibalize the front list sales, especially if publishers window the release, meaning they're not putting their newest titles in subscription services. They're waiting, and then once the title's a little older, they'll put them in. The last thing I will mention before concluding is that the creator economy is really starting to change how writers and authors think about publishing opportunities. So, we've seen with Substack in particular, which I'm going to mention again here in a second, companies trying to offer authors other ways to profit off their writing that aren't through traditional methods. We're seeing new apps like Clubhouse offer rewards to creators on the platform who bring in audience, who create really great experiences for users. And everyone else now has started, to follow that model and offer rewards in some way. So even the older social media like Facebook or Twitter are now introducing new programs to reward the creators who have made those places attractive for users. So for instance, there's tipping now on some of these platforms. The companies are offering grants to creators. There's ad revenue shares, there's subscription revenue shares, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things are often true of the online literature sites that I mentioned earlier. So like Wattpad and Webtoon and China Lit and some of these others, have some of these monetization methods, and they're looking at always considering other ways to keep people or attract people to keep producing content and to reward them for the most engaging content. So something that just happened, I think this was 2 weeks ago, perhaps, July 1 is when it happened. This is a report in the New York Post where they say that Substack signed an ex-Forbes writer. He's an established author of like 3 or 4 other books. Substack signs an ex-Forbes writer as it seeks to disrupt book publishing. I don't think this is exactly disrupting book publishing, but it's a pretty interesting deal where Substack has paid an undisclosed amount in advance to this author to serialize his book on the Substack platform. And people can sign up to get a free newsletter from him, which doesn't include the book, or they can pay, and every week they'll get an installment from the book. Now, we don't yet know what's going to happen when the serialization is finished. Is a book going to be released? Will it be released by Substack? Will it be released by the author? Who's going to benefit, et cetera, et cetera? We don't know. But with the creator economy and all of these different companies trying to have the best content, we're just seeing a lot of new business models open up, which for me, it's better when there's more competition like this, more models to choose from. You don't have to be worked into a corner with only this type of deal, with only this type of company. So it kind of stretches your imagination in terms of what's possible. I'll end with a quote from Marcus Doley, the CEO of Penguin Random House, something he said last month about how publishers work. And I think a lot of times writers in particular forget this. If we never fail, we don't publish enough. It's a creative business. And yes, it's a risky business. Our very name, Random House, says it all. Random House comes from the fact that everything in publishing is random, including producing breakout bestsellers. And thank God, because if we had the formula for bestsellers, we would only publish bestsellers. So thank God it's random. Thank God it's unpredictable. There is no formula. In essence, every book is a new creative entrepreneurial endeavor or venture. And his point here broadly is that half of books that get published fail, like they don't earn back what was invested, or they don't perform to the expectation that was set out. And this is situation normal. And I think writers of all backgrounds, the more they can understand this, I think, the more accepting they can be of the fact that a book just didn't work out, and maybe it's nobody's fault, or maybe the publisher did drop the ball, but publishing is in fact a business of failure, and every book is a startup. So I hope that offers reassurance that publishers expect to fail and they're not blaming you for the failure. If you enjoyed this presentation, I report on these issues all year long in an email newsletter called The Hot Sheet. So you can find out more about the Hot Sheet at hotsheetpub.com. It comes out every 2 weeks. It's mainly for professional authors, people who geek out on this stuff and really benefit from knowing what the trends are and where the opportunities lie. If you're totally new and haven't published a thing yet, it might be overwhelming unless you just love geeking out on these industry issues. So thank you very much for coming to my talk today, and I hope to see you online.